Welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Allison Gampel, Associate Director of Alumni Engagement at York University. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar is part of our Scholars Hub speaker series and features timely and relevant educational lectures by academics and researchers from York. We're pleased to be able to continue with this series, allowing even more alumni and friends to hear from some of the university's leading scholars. As this event is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'm grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land. We have a ton of great lectures in store for you this year, from family math literacy to women's mental health, and even the 1-year anniversary of the COVID-19 shutdown, right? For more information about the Scholars Hub at Home series, as well as our other virtual events, please feel free to visit our website at yorku.ca/alumni and friends, or email us anytime at alumni@yorku.ca. And if you're looking for more exciting and interesting research news from the university, make sure that you check out Brainstorm. You can find it at yorku.ca/research. There you'll find stories and videos, everything ranging from pandemic coping mechanisms to a PhD student's tool for symptom management in oncology patients. As those of you who've joined us for previous events will know, we do always like to get to know our audience a little bit better by asking a question. So today's question, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of pandemic and social determinants of health? That's our question. It should pop up on your screen. It's popped up on your screen, and I'll give you a moment or two to answer. Great. Thank you everyone for participating in the poll. We love learning about you and tailoring the content to your level of knowledge and preferences. For a bit of housekeeping, if you need any help with this Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button that's located on the bottom of your screen and enter your question. We have a team on the back end that's ready to help you. That same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speaker later on when we allow for the Q&A period that will follow our professors' presentations. For our friends who are watching live on Facebook, if you do have questions that you would like asked, please feel free to submit them through the comment section and the team will send them my way. So on to today's talk. It's titled, "The COVID-19 Pandemic Reinforces the Importance of the Social Determinants of Health." It's featuring Dr. Dennis Raphael from our Faculty of Health. A little bit about our speaker today. Dennis Raphael is a professor of health policy and management at York University. He's the editor of Social Determinants of Health, Canadian Perspectives, Health Promotion, and Quality of Life in Canada, Essential Readings, as well as Immigration, Public Policy, and Health, Newcomer Experiences in Developed Nations. Dennis, now I'm cueing you to turn on your camera and mic, please, and then to share your screen. And we're delighted to welcome Dr. Raphael. It's an absolute pleasure to have you join us here today.
Okay.
There you are. Okay, so you can share your screen. It is shared and we are on. So I am going to disappear and leave it over to you to chat with our audience. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I'm going to, as usual, throw a lot of slides at you. Each of them has a reference where you can get it. Also, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to come back and look at this at YouTube. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that Kurt Lewin once said, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. And the question is, considering the situation we're in, what do we know about the social determinants of health, and how can it inform not only explaining the situation we're in, but hopefully improving things for the future? The first thing I just quickly want to acknowledge, and quite frankly, I'm surprised. I've been banging my head for the last 30 years trying to get people to move beyond healthy behaviors, fruits and vegetables, and exercising to look at the broader determinants of health. And one thing that's happened with this COVID-19 thing is has been, to my mind, a remarkable acceptance of all of this, at least in terms of the media. And Dr. Tam puts out a report that touches all the bases here. Unfortunately, the problem is, despite this recognition of all of this, there seems to be very little interest in actually doing anything about it. We do have a literature that's coming out very quickly. This is from my colleague in the UK, Claire Bambra, that basically has taken the old Whitehead and Dahlgren model of the determinants of health. And of course, we're focused on the green things here, but also the broader factors that lead this. And there's an excellent article that talks about the COVID-19 in terms of what we know about health inequalities. In terms of the situation here, to date, we don't really have the kind of data they have from the US about mortality. But we do have some great data from Toronto that basically shows the overrepresentation of particular groups experiencing or coming down with COVID-19. So on the right, you can see that 48% of people in Toronto are white, but they only represent 18% of the cases. In contrast, Black people are only 9% of the population in Toronto, yet they account for 23% of the determinants of health. And as I mentioned, surprisingly, there's a recognition that all of these groups that are overrepresented are also the groups that are overrepresented in terms of poverty, in terms of precarious work. So that's certainly an advance over the past. And here we can see also from Toronto that the poorest of the poor that represent the poorest of the poor that represent 14% of the population in Toronto account for 26% of the cases. And on the right side of the screen, the wealthy that represent 21% of the population of Toronto are only accounting for 7% of the cases. So clearly we have an income gradient, we have an ethnicity gradient, and the question is, how do we make sense of it? Well, turns out that people sometimes say to me, as a result of all of this, are we going to change things? And what I discovered was back in 2009, these same factors were recognized. So as you can see on the left, that these are the predictors of people ending up in hospitals as a result of H1N1. And you can see on the left all of the determinants of health: deprivation, employment rate, low income. And to give away the story, I don't think that this knowledge that we had in 2009 actually led to anything being done differently. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen again. And just for those of you that are statistically minded, what was the odds ratio of people ending up in hospitals? Aboriginal had a greater risk ratio of 5 times. So for every one non-Aboriginal person, 5 Aboriginal people ended up in hospital during this first phase. I'm just going to look at the first phase. We could see that there's a little bit here about adults being over 18. But if we look at the related issues of determinants of health, we can see that the material deprivation identified through a variety of measures were really good predictors of people being hospitalized. We could also see that the social deprivation, and these were probably done at the neighborhood level. So back then we knew that deprivation, that indigenous descent of and social deprivation were good predictors of being hospitalized. So again, we would have liked to think that let's do something about this. And we'll get back to that. So following few slides are taken from this book. And this is the traditional Michael Marmot, Eric Bruna model of how conditions of society, living and working conditions. Now, if we think about COVID-19, certainly there's been emphasis on the social structure and how we distribute resources, income. We certainly have been talking about the social environment, about crowding, about three-generation families, about these kinds of factors. We certainly have logged into precarious work, the kind of work situations that people are continuing to work in because they absolutely have to. We certainly know a lot about stress and again, people that are deprived, people that experience precarious work have greater psychosocial stresses, which contribute to illness. And what we don't know yet is the exact mechanisms. I mean, we can talk about crowding, we can talk about being forced to work, but it's long been known that the psychobiological stress reaction hits the immune system. And to date, we've not really seen much emphasis on whether people that are vulnerable are actually, what are the mechanisms by which they are vulnerable? And I'll ask you people to remember in the video series, Unhealthy Outcomes, Is Inequality Making Us Sick? There was a lot of focus on these cold virus studies where Dr. Sheldon Cohn would inject people through the nose with cold viruses. And what he discovered that one's income, one's education level, one's childhood were really good predictors of whether people came down with a cold or not. So a good open question is whether, all things considered, well-off people, even if they're exposed to the virus, may or may not be less likely to come down with it. So the point simply here is there's a tremendous literature that already exists about how being marginalized, vulnerable, subject to deprivation makes people more likely to become ill. And again, we've known all of this. The question is whether we've ever been willing to do anything about it. So here's the situation. The Canadian Facts is online. You can download it. What were we doing before all of this came along in terms of taking care of people in terms of their living and working conditions? And the answer is, well, we certainly did more than Turkey, Israel, Chile, and the United States and Mexico seem to be doing, but certainly reducing poverty, notwithstanding all the anti-poverty programs and strategies and all over, have basically never really led to Canada being among the developed world leaders in reducing poverty rates. And one can only imagine what the poverty rate is now, considering that the most vulnerable have been the ones most subject to the financial effects. Also, generally, we're not a very generous country in terms of providing family benefits. And again, everybody will talk from today till tomorrow how important families are, how important our kids are. But basically, when you decide to have a family in Canada, you're on your own. And you can see it's quite a contrast to the kinds of family benefits, whether it's childcare, baby bonuses, and a whole range of other benefits that are usually provided. Certainly, we've not been improving the situation in terms of part-time and temporary work. Very quickly here, you can see part-time work has been gradually increasing over time, as has temporary work, which tends not only to be low-paid work, but also tends to be work without benefits. And certainly employment protection. We really are world leaders in this, in that for the most part in legislation, we have no employment protection. And basically what it means is that in most other countries, there are guidelines and regulations in place before you're terminated from your job. And much of this has to do with the fact that only 31% of us belong to unions and are represented by collective agreements. So these are all the conditions that already existed before the COVID-19 thing came along. Again, not to pound you into the ground on this, we're certainly not doing a great job on household food insecurity. One can look at severe food insecurity. We can look at Ontario, and basically 3% of people have real obvious food insecurity issues. Moderate is where you're thinking about it, changing your diet. 4.3% might be you don't actually experience, but you're thinking about it all the time. And again, when you look around, occasionally I say, maybe I'm getting this all wrong and things are really great in Canada. But if you do a little bit of looking, you can see that basically housing and financial stress is common among Canadians, not just the poorest of the poor. And dealing with rising housing costs negatively impacted my mental health at least once. And these are all issues that are subject to public policy decisions by governing authorities. What do we do if you lose your job, you don't do too well? Again, you can see that in the short term, if you happen to have been working and paid in, and keep in mind that half of people in the GTA who are working, if they lose their job, don't even qualify for benefits. But if you did, you get 2/3 of the average income, which is a maximum, I believe, of about 60% of 42,000. So you're not doing great. And over time, this would be the long-term one. We only provide benefits for 1 year, actually more like 50 weeks, while many other countries provide more. And certainly if you're on social assistance, you don't want to be on social assistance. And in that you get 30% of the average income, which puts you well below the internationally agreed upon poverty line. So before COVID-19 came along, we weren't really doing a great job in taking care of people. And certainly we know that income and the effects of all the things I just mentioned play out in terms of cardiovascular disease. They play out in terms of diabetes. This is basically showing increases in diabetes over time, standardized for age, I would think. And diabetes, especially adult onset diabetes, especially susceptible to conditions of deprivation and stress. So what's our situation now? As I mentioned, people have really jumped on this. This is policy options. While certain Canadians are much more financially vulnerable to COVID-19, this was defined as families that if they had a 2-month work stoppage, would put them below the poverty line for lack of resources. And you can see that overall, we're dealing with 27% of Canadians were identified as financially vulnerable. And if you look at the situations of recent immigrants, over half of them, if we look at non-elderly unattached men, certainly lone mothers, despite everything we know about the health effects of living under conditions of deprivation, 57% of lone mothers were already financially vulnerable before COVID-19 came along. Now, it turns out that whenever there's a shock, it always seems to affect the other people the worst. So for example, these are the percentage of dual earn owners in which both earners can work at home. In other words, you continue to get paid. And what you can see is the well-off, like me, are able to work at home and continue to get paid. And among the top decile, or the top 20%, you can see about half of people are able to work from home. And the people that are already the most vulnerable, the bottom decile, the second decile, the bottom 20% in terms of income, these are the people that are absolutely unable to work from home. So either they lose their jobs or they're forced to go work. And considering that they don't have sick benefits, well, we know about all of that. So what this is doing, it's magnifying these inequalities that were already there. These basically, again, what percentage of people during this pandemic have been able to at least work half their usual hours. And again, what you see is the people at the top are the ones most likely to be able to work at least half their usual hours. And what you can see here, that the most marginalized, already precarious, are the ones that are showing a decline, a profound decline in their ability to work at least half their hours. So the good news is that if you go to the academic literature, there really has been this acceptance and awareness of the determinants and the broader public policy implications. So you can see here in the Canadian Journal of Public Health on the top left, on the top right, BMJ Global Health, on the bottom left, social determinants and COVID-19 disparities, and on the bottom right, the article I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 pandemic and health inequalities. The media has picked up on it. The pandemic has pushed back the curtain on how decades of austerity have left Canadians and the healthcare system more vulnerable. We have global news, health inequities. They're actually using the word inequities. And they're not simply saying that people are coming down with COVID-19 because they're eating too much or they're not exercising, or if they just ate fruits and vegetables, everything would be great. Canadians have been kind of shocked into awareness. And as I said, this is great news for me because finally some of this stuff seems to have gotten some traction. Pandemic in the fields, and again, but the thing was, these foreign workers already had all of these issues. They had the right to not unionize. But again, this stuff has all been there, but now it's been brought to the fore. But again, the issue comes down to, what about the prospects for the future? Is this going to sink in? Is somebody going to come out and say, well, precarious work, or better yet, the long-term care stuff with the PSAs being forced to work multiple jobs and so forth. So this is an article that basically outlines COVID-19 has further exposed the strong, and I can't see that word behind there because my pictures, let me see if I can move this. The strong associations between race, ethnicity, so forth and so on. Racism, segregation, and inequality have been invisibly and pervasively embedded. Socioeconomic factors that negatively influence health outcomes must be identified and contextualized. The fact that Canada has 22% of its workers are low wage is not an accident. We can specify exactly why that's the case. And of course, we always need data to talk about it. Well, some people, and I saw Pat Armstrong on the CBC News last night, have been talking about this for 30 years. And so there's been attention directed to that. And the fact that mortality rates are much higher in for-profit long-term care. And of course, who brought in for-profit long-term care in the 90s? It just happened to be Mike Harris, who now sits on the board of Chartwell Retirement Residences and is benefiting from the policy changes he made in the 90s. Unfortunately, the clients are not benefiting, they're dying. But again, this issue has been brought up. And Ontario's NDP, for example, has suggested a variety of things that probably should have been done 20 years ago, and making the entire system public and non-profit. So things are happening. There's a greater awareness. The question is whether this is actually going to gain some traction. And what I'm going to conclude with is a paragraph from an article, which is available online, that talked about the unequal impact, emergency neoliberalism, and welfare policy. And this would be the big takeaway. The pandemic has served to expose the profound weaknesses of the Canadian welfare state. it's increasingly clear the very workers who now ensure the operations of stores and medications and care for the elderly deserve job security, a living wage, access to affordable housing, and free public transit. One would hope that the income programs created to support Canadian households and businesses during the pandemic and efforts towards improved care management and long-term care would become permanent features and serve as a basis for broader restructuring. Yet such outcomes seem far-reaching and not at all attuned to the trajectory of neoliberal restructuring and the arc of current state policy, especially in the liberal welfare states. Now, for those who are saying, what's a liberal welfare state? You can go to the Canadian Facts online, and the last section talks about the political economy of different forms of the welfare state. So they are going to give you a question. Shall I move to the next slide? I will. Okay. Well, now I see, and I'd like to think you are beginning to see why we have a problem in terms of governance and public policy. And what I'll simply say, I was at a presentation a few years ago at Ryerson, and we were talking about these issues. And basically I said, well, if you are concerned about what public policy has looked like over the last 30 years in Canada, you have to ask yourself, which are the two political parties that have been in power and influence? And if you've been voting for them, then you basically have been endorsing the public policy that's out there. I'll give Justin credit for the responses to the pandemic, but I'll also remind you that it was during the 1990s that the welfare state was decimated by the Chrétien-Martin government. And I'll also remind you that a lot of the labor legislation, a lot of the problematic public policy that's out there has been a product of both the conservative and the liberal parties. So that's the little kind of dig I'll take at some of you. So thank you. We do have a listserv. It's been around since I showed up in York in 2001. Been around since 2004. And it's pretty easy to join it. You could type in STOH listserv and you might get a security warning, but just kind of work through it. Or you can just email me and I could put you on. So I am done. What do I do? Do I stop my?
You can stop your screen share now.
Got it.
And then it'll be just you and I that are on the screen. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for being here with us and for sharing your knowledge and all of that data and statistics that certainly give pause and reason to think about changes that can be made. So I really appreciate you being with us and sharing this with us. And we do have a number of questions that are coming in from the audience. So I will take the chance to ask you some of them. Just want to do a bit of housekeeping for our audience to make sure everyone knows how to ask questions. If you're with us here on Zoom, you type in your questions via the Q&A function. And if you're with us on Facebook, type your questions into the comment section and I will ask them out loud to Dr. Raphael on your behalf. Okay, so ready to get started with the questions? Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question that's coming in from Kathy, who's asking, curious what the speaker's thoughts are about the role of the awakening for many regarding treatment of BIPOC in spring 2020 and the media highlighting more of the inequities, especially regarding COVID.
BIPOC, I'm sorry, that question.
BIPOC, yes, this individual is asking, what are your thoughts regarding some of the new awareness around Black, Indigenous, and people of color that's come out in spring 2020, and has that impacted some of the inequities around COVID? How does that come into play?
You know, basically, clearly, there's more to all of this than income and class. Clearly, there's racism, there's discrimination. Uh, I'm old enough to remember the Stephen Lewis report. What was that, the 70s and 80s, that talked about systemic racism and discrimination. So it's better than it was. Joe Biden used the word systemic racial inequities yesterday. So the words are there. It can't but help. However, there's always a problem of identity politics. And that is along the lines of you begin to be concerned with discrimination to the exclusion of issues of class and inequality. So Barack Obama becomes the first Black man to become, well, he's biracial actually, to become president. And that's a good role model. And certainly there's benefits from it, but Barack Obama doesn't do anything about inequity, doesn't do anything about inequality. So Kamala is a South Asian Black woman. That's good. But are they going to do anything about the great majority of Black people who are suffering the kinds of marginalization and deprivation? So we want to be concerned with discrimination. We want to be concerned with rectifying all of these horrible things. But it isn't just a question of feeling good and eliminating discrimination, because all of this is still embedded in a profoundly inequitable society in terms of wages, in terms of job security, and those issues that the person asked about have to be embedded within, I think, a mature critical analysis of the nature of Canadian society.
Thank you. So what do you think are some of the means of actually improving the living and working conditions of Canadians?
Well, basically, a number of years ago, I was asked what was the main one thing that we could do to improve the health of Canadians. This was for the Canadian Nursing Commission. And I said, make it easy to unionize. And people just stared at me like I'd come off a rocket ship from Jupiter. What you could do is, first of all, one has to educate themselves. Why are things the way they are? Why are housing prices going through the roof, for example, in Toronto, and nobody seems to think that's a problem? Why is it that if you do work minimum wage in Ontario and just about every other province, you do not have enough money to live? So I think one has to begin to ask the questions, what are the economic, political, and social forces that are driving this inequitable distribution of income, education, housing? And as I say to my students all the time, if we are so concerned about intellectual capital, we would do what many other countries do, which would have university free tuition for universities and colleges, not rocket science. And similarly, if we actually did believe in promoting healthy childhood and healthy children, we'd make sure that if you have two parents working, they would be earning enough money that you wouldn't be living in poverty. So the long and the short takeaway, especially, I went through the list of all the participants, and boy, I didn't recognize any of your names. So you have a new generation of people coming into this. The Canadian Facts is a good, quick introduction to all of this. But the stuff's been around. And what I've learned is people like you come in, they get exposed to this, they get excited, they think good things are going to happen. And then 15, 20 years later, they leave the field and a whole new generation comes in and gets all excited about all of this. So I think one has to really begin to ask fundamental questions about the nature of power, of influence, and who gets to call the shots in the making of public policy. That's not easy to do. It's easy to tell people to exercise and eat fruits and vegetables. But I think one needs a really mature, critical analysis of the nature of power and influence in society.
I hear you, and it leads to one of the questions that's coming in from our audience from Faisal, who's actually asking about the fact that the pandemic response has been fragmented between federal and provincial governments, and so has healthcare. And Faisal's asking, how do we ensure that temporary protections like CERB remain permanent and get transformed into social benefits? Or should they? Should they become permanent?
Well, it's that same question, and hi, Faisal. Uh, it's the same question again, is why was it that, for example, in many countries, when you lose your job, you get 80% of your income, you get job training, you get all of these things you need until you are back and employed again. It's that same question. And what needs to be done? Education, mobilization. And one of the biggest problems we have is we don't have a central agency or organization. In a chapter I read recently, they talk about the fact that in Europe, you have these very strong central labor bodies that not only represent all the different unions, they negotiate on their part. So the Canadian Labor Congress has no power or influence. So part of that is the weak organized union sector. And again, this will be a challenge. We don't have a political party that's talking about this. We don't have you don't have the NDP, you don't have Jagmeet Singh, you don't have supposedly people on the left willing to make this a central issue. And of course, you don't have any government taking this on, which is a real source of a problem. So what's the answer? Education, mobilization, and getting people who should be doing this stuff to start doing it. And again, I'd like to say there was an easy way to do it, but there isn't. There isn't. But certainly the media has to be brought along. Political parties of the left. I'd always like to think that Justin Trudeau has had a, what do you call that? You have a epiphany or revelation that basically, they did get rid of the finance minister who came from Bay Street, and now you have a new finance minister who's written books about inequality. So one would always hope that the left wing of the Liberal Party might transcend its past. But the long and the short of it is that we do have 4 pages in the Canadian Facts at the end that suggest things that could happen. And right now I can't rattle them off, but certainly it would be to recognize, to get allies together and suggest to people that we need to do more than simply publish more articles or doing webinars. We have to see what the buttons and levers of power are and try to shift them. Because you can see, for example, in Ontario, despite everybody calling for paid sick leave, not happening. They're not doing it. And I'll ask you the question, why do you think Doug Ford's not doing it? Because he's been told by people not to do it.
So then, in essence, does addressing these social determinants of health, does that require, and this question actually comes from one of our audience members, Asha Maria, does addressing these determinants of health require changing or revising our entire capitalistic economic system?
She triggered me to one thing that I do talk about, and I'm sorry it slipped my mind: proportional representation. If we had proportional representation, that would turn public policy around on a dime. And that is the case of what you see in just about every other Western developed country, because you'd never have majority governments again. Whether it's Aaron or Justin, they would not be able to govern without the support of the NDP. And if the NDP, so you'd have constant minority governments. Now, capitalism. Well, I'm not 19 anymore, so I don't anticipate that we're going to replace the system. But when you look at the forms that capitalism takes, for example, in the Nordic countries, or even in continental Europe, basically, I think Engels or Marx would revel in the advances that have been made. What you find in Scandinavia, and of course in many of the continental countries, is they're certainly capitalists. Certainly Volkswagen and Audi and all these Scandic all want to make money. They all have stockholders. They all pay shares. But the forms have evolved in a partnership that is so profoundly different looking from what we have here that it would almost take a revolution for us to have their forms of capitalism as compared to what we have. Now, down the line, as some of you know, there were some who believe that it's inevitable. I certainly have books by Harvey up on my shelf that talks about the end of capitalism. Certainly not in my lifetime, but you don't have to do that. You don't have to throw the whole system into the garbage can as much as to clean it up and shape it up and make it work for most people.
Thank you for that. On a more positive note, I'm going to read a question that came in from Valerie, and Valerie writes, and I think this reflects the feeling of all of us in the audience. Thank you so much for this excellent talk. So we really do thank you. Valerie's wondering if you're seeing any signs of hope, any grassroots movements that you think might put enough pressure on the power holders and decision makers that they will influence real change.
All I can do is I know what's going on out there. I know that out of 36 Ontario health units, 23 of them have adopted Sudbury Public's health video, Let's Start a Conversation About Health. They did that on their own. It's grassroots. I do know that in contrast to 20 years ago, every public health unit, every healthcare professional, every NGO knows that all of the issues they're concerned with are health issues. So the first edition of the Canadian Facts was downloaded 1.2 million times, which boggles the imagination. So it's out there. The problem is, and I had a long hour-and-a-half interview with a colleague of mine who's doing a study of why isn't this stuff on the political agenda? And for the life of us, we can't understand why political parties don't grab hold of this. Because if 60% of Canadians' wages are stagnating, if 50% of Canadians wouldn't be able to get through if their paycheck was a week late, why are they not taking this on as a political issue that could push it right up to the higher level? And when I say to my students, I'm teaching a Determinants of Health course Monday night, I showed them videos of AOC from New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, how she just talks about how poverty is shameful, how it's immoral. Or you put Bernie Sanders up, you listen to him talking about corporate power. We don't have anybody who's willing to talk like that. Jugmeat talks about love and caring. Well, unfortunately, love and caring is not going to raise your wages. It's not going to provide you with affordable housing, and it's not going to fight the profound discrimination that Black people, LGBT people have. So it is hopeful that we're further along than we were 20 years ago in terms of knowledge, but we're further behind than we were 20 years ago. So I'll be very honest, which really doesn't help any of us listening to this. I take great pride in seeing that my work and other work is cited in Norway, Denmark, Germany, where actually my influence, whatever that may be, seems to be on countries outside. Also, and I mentioned I have some of my grad students on this thing, I take a lot of pleasure in illuminating and making explicit some of what we know about all of this. Do I see positives? Well, this is going to be the crunch. Are they going to do anything about long-term care? That's the most obvious. Got all the data, people are dying, people are more likely to get it in for profit, that all of the money that's been given as a result of the government programs has been doled out to shareholders of long-term care. If you can't do that, what chance do we have about wages? Next month, we have a really good article, a graduate student and I, Jessica Mueller, on labor unions are good for your health. That's coming out in the Lindsay, I forget the name of the newspaper that comes out in Kawartha. And Jessica and I have just prepared an article for Health Promotion International on unionization and collective agreement as health promoting. So do I feel really good? I got a 20-year-old? No, I don't feel good. I don't think, this was even prior to COVID. I just don't see anything really improving, which is why I'm also writing an article about raising the language level. I never got as much attention as I got when I wrote an article in the Toronto Star accusing Doug Ford of social murder. I also got pushback for the right wing. That was kind of scary as well. So I really don't feel very good about the situation. I really don't. Are we going to see real changes afterwards? If I were to go on a 0 to 10 scale, with 10 being super optimistic, 0 really, really bad, I would probably put myself at a 4. Because it's just not happening. There's no force of gravity. There's no center of gravity. And David Brady, who does wonderful stuff on the political economy of poverty, says that the only way you get this good stuff, good public policy, is but what he calls institutionalized left power. And our political parties are so conservative that the conservative parties in Europe are much further to the left than the NDP is in Canada. I don't see it happening. I don't. So yeah, not good news.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That was our last question, and I was hoping that we might end on a more positive note. But I think it's really important, to share the research that you're doing and the work that you're doing. And there are a record number of people here in our audience who are hanging on to these words and hopefully will inspire some of this change that you're speaking about. So on that note, on behalf of all of us, the alumni engagement team and our audience and the university, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and insight. We really appreciate it.
And again, if people email me, I do have the listserv. I do have a Twitter feed when these articles come out next month from the Lindsay newspaper about unions. And certainly, in contrast to 20 years ago when I would talk about this stuff and that was it, there's a lot to write about. A lot has been written. There's a lot of resources. And it's not just me, but it's people in food insecurity and housing. There's a whole vast literature that if we wanted to use it, we could use. And it's very easy to get hold of and to access.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So on that note, I will allow you to turn off your camera and mic, and you can go have yourself a nice rest of your day and enjoy your work. Thank you so much. And just to wrap things up, we do have one last poll question for our audience. It should appear on your screen. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge of the topic of today's presentation following this insightful discussion? So have a quick answer to that. And as always, a recording of this talk will be posted to our York Alumni YouTube channel. So please feel free to share it with your friends. All are welcome to share in the knowledge that we're generating here at York University. You can find us, as always, on LinkedIn and Facebook by searching York University Alumni, and on Instagram and Twitter by searching @YorkU Alumni. We always welcome your feedback and your suggestions, either on our social media channels or by email at alumni@yorku.ca. Looking forward, February is Black History Month, and we have a number of events for our alumni community. Next week, Wednesday, February 3rd, Scholars Up at Home will be back, and we're featuring gospel music, a Canadian perspective. Dr. Karen Burke, who's an associate professor in our Department of Music in AMPD, will be the one presenting. On February 9th, as part of our Moving Forward webinar series, the Language Arts and Professional Studies faculty is hosting, Liberal Arts and Professional Studies faculty is hosting a talk that's called How York Alumni Are Advancing Initiatives in Black Communities. And then on Wednesday, February 17th, in honor of Family Day, join us back for a Scholars Hub at Home lecture titled A Family-Oriented Approach to Teaching Mathematics. I know my children are going to love that one, wink, wink. That's featuring Dr. Jude Kong, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics within our Faculty of Science. To register for these events, please visit our website, yorku.ca/alumni and friends, and click on events. And on that note, I say goodbye. Thank you all for being here with us today, and be well.